John chapter 21 is where we're reading from today. So just to give some context, by the time we get to this point, Jesus has died and then risen again, and he's appeared to his disciples. And we looked at a bit of that, of him appearing to Mary last week. As things go on, he appears to all of the disciples and more. And then we get to chapter 21, and Peter has this idea that he and some of the disciples should go out for a little fishing trip overnight. So they have this overnight fishing trip on the Sea of Tiberias or Galilee, and all night they managed to catch no fish. No fish whatsoever. And then there's this guy on the shore who tells them, well, why don't you try your net on the other side? Now, just to, if you think about it, you're in a boat and you haven't caught any fish from that side of the boat. It doesn't really make sense that you'd catch them from that side of the boat because it's just water underneath you. But they probably did remember a time when Jesus had said something like that before, and so they do it, and they catch so many fish. And John, who writes the book of John, the Gospel of John, he realizes it's Jesus who's on the shore. And then when Peter realizes that, he runs to shore. Oh no, he doesn't run, he swims to shore. He gets out of the boat and he swims and wades so he can get to Jesus first. And then they kind of all come to shore. And we read, this is just before the reading that we're picking up. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus had prepared them some breakfast. Okay, so this is the context. This is what's happened when we get to our reading. And we're going to read from verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time, he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And Jesus said this to indicate what kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." That passage from the book of John, and we're looking at Peter. So we had put out as the title of today's service, "How Deep Is Your Love?" And if you're a certain, probably above a certain age, but not very old, maybe a certain song will come to your mind. So if you hear "How Deep Is Your Love?" you might hear in your minds, "How deep is your love? Is your love? How deep is your love?" Now, I've only concluded that just since because I started going with the "How deep is your love?" It kept coming to my mind. It probably keeps coming to your mind. And so I thought if I ever keep coming back to that phrase, "How deep is your love?" the best way to celebrate it is simply by, "How deep is your love? Is your love?" You can't sing along because we can't sing along to anything. Okay. So, how deep is your love? This is a really important question. And what I want to do is just suggest that you just think about some of the things that you love. Okay. Now, can we have the next slide? How much do you love these things? And this is maybe a chance to, if you're sitting either here with others or at home with others, maybe you can discuss how much you love these things. If you're sitting on your own, just think through it. Maybe you could actually rank them. Which is your favorite? What's your number one love out of these, and 2 and 3 and 4? Also, what things would come, first before some of those things? So just take a minute or so to think through that maybe.
How deep is your love? Is your love? How deep is your love?
So, how deep is your love? I mean, how much you love these things. Let me just see, because there's a good number of folk here. I mean, who would say, just put your hands up, that your number one love out of these was chocolate? I mean, who's going for chocolate? I mean, actually, let's assume that we all are going to put Jesus as number one, okay? So what would be number two? I mean, maybe that isn't the right assumption. Probably the point of this is it's testing us, but we know that's the right answer. So not including Jesus, what would be our number two love? Who would go for these things? Who would go for chocolate? There's a few hands, okay. Who would go for social media? Okay, a couple, yeah. And who would go for TV? Okay, so there's a few for everything. Who's got something that would definitely come before any of these things, not including Jesus? I mean, a couple of hands going up. Okay, for a couple of you, I can guess maybe what they might be as well. Okay, so how much do you love these things? Well, it's really hard, isn't it? Particularly if you try and rank them. I mean, which is your favorite out of all these? They're so different. I mean, talking about Jesus and chocolate, you could love them both. But you love them both in very different ways. So it's hard to say which you love the most. But I guess the question it really comes back to is how deep is your love? I won't play it again now. And that's kind of the question, or one of the things that Jesus was asking Peter on the beach. If you can imagine the scene, then they've come in from that all-night fishing trip. It's been bad night in terms of fishing, except it was finished off really well because they got 153 fish, so many fish, it's breaking the net. Peter's come in and then he's gone out, and he's the big strong man who's been able to haul all those fish in. And then he has this conversation with Jesus. And he's still so delighted to see Jesus. I mean, he has seen him since he was raised from the dead, but Jesus asks, "Do you love me more than these?" Now, there's a question that's a really important and interesting question, which is this. What is these? What is Jesus talking about when he says these? And if you read a Bible commentary or something like that, it might give you a few different possibilities. It could be all the fishing things. I mean, all the fish that you've caught. Peter presumably loved fishing. And Jesus says, "Do you love me more than that?" Do that's a really important question. I mean, we talk about chocolate and social media, TV, or the other things that we might love. Do we love Jesus more than those things? I know we know the right answer is yes, but does that show in the actions that we have? What do we love the most? It's a good question. I don't think that was necessarily what Jesus was asking Peter. Do you love me more than, the fishing? But it's a really important question to think through. Also, some people suggest, well, maybe Jesus is asking, do you love me more than these? As in, do you love me more than you love the other disciples? The other disciples who are there with them. The fact is they're stuck together. They've been through a lot together. They probably were really quite fond of each other. And maybe Jesus is saying, do you love me more than you love the disciples? That's also a really good question. because it reminds us that we do need to love Jesus more than anything. In fact, how you can love each other the best is by loving Jesus even more. And that may not always seem to make sense, but if you love your husband or wife, or your mother or father, or your son and daughter more than Jesus, then that is not a very healthy thing. The way that you'll love them best of all is if you love Jesus even more. I don't think Jesus was necessarily saying, do you love me more than you love the disciples, though? I think maybe he was asking, do you love me more than the disciples love me? And the reason I think that is because of some of the things that Peter had said before. You see, Peter had previously boasted about how much he loved Jesus, how even if everyone else, all the other disciples, ran away and stopped loving Jesus, Peter would carry on loving Jesus. And what we see in this passage that we just read is not only does he ask this once, do you love me more than these? He asks him 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And when he asks him the 3rd time, Peter is hurt. Now, some people talk about the different words for love in the Greek. I don't think that's particularly significant. And this evening, we're going to meet for our Sunday supper where we can just reflect and talk about these things. If you're interested in that, you can ask that question of why I don't think that's particularly significant later. I don't think it's particularly important what the underlying Greek words were, particularly as they were speaking Aramaic. But what's really important is what it says is that Peter was hurt because Jesus asked it for a 3rd time. And I think one of the reasons why it particularly hurt Peter is because something else had happened 3 times. And you probably know this connection already, but here's another little connection. Do you know it specifies, did you hear, and I just read one of the verses from just before our passage, that Jesus had made a coal fire. One other mention of a coal fire in the New Testament. And that was another time when Peter was standing by a fire. This time he wasn't with Jesus, he was with a few other people who were also huddled around this fire, and the place was outside the temple, in the courts of the temple, when Jesus had been arrested and was being tried. And Peter was round this coal fire. And he was asked, aren't you one of the friends of Jesus? Aren't you one of the people who are following him? Aren't you with that Jesus of Nazareth? I mean, even your accent sounds like it's from up there. And 3 times Peter said, I do not know him. I do not know him. I do not know him. And then something happened once he had said it a 3rd time to a 3rd question. There was a cockerel that crowed. And we even have it up on the screen, cock-a-doodle-doo, twice, as Mark specifies. Well, Mark doesn't specify the cock-a-doodle-doo. He specifies the cock crowed twice. The reason that's significant is because Jesus had told him that he would deny him 3 times before the cockerel crowed. That was one of the times when Peter said, no, I love you more than everyone else. I'll never fall away. I love you more than everyone else. But even Peter, who had that big boast, he said, I do not know him 3 times. When he heard the cockerel crow, he broke down in tears because he realized he'd failed Jesus. And the thing that this brings us to, that the lesson that we can learn from this is hopefully on the next slide, I think. On this slide, the reason then Jesus asks him 3 times, and how that's so significant is 3 times Peter failed him. 3 times Jesus asks him, do you love me? And that hurts him because he's reminded of his own lack. And it teaches Peter and it teaches us that your love for God is smaller than you'd like to admit, or that you'd like to even think. We might think like Peter, oh, I always love God. I'll never deny him. I'd never let him down. I think one of the things that this whole passage teaches us is that our love is weaker. Our love is fainter, as we sang in that song, than we would like to admit. And it's a really helpful thing to admit that our love is weak, that we want to love Jesus more. We really do, but it's not as strong as we'd like it to be. And that's where we're going to stop for now, but we're going to come back to. It seems a bit depressing just to finish off on the fact that our love for God is smaller than we'd like to admit, but we're going to come back to something wonderful and positive, because having thought about the fact that our love is not our love for God is smaller than you'd like to admit. Your love for God, however big that love seems to be, is smaller than you'd like to admit. But on the other side, something else we're seeing from this passage that we're looking at is that God's love for you is bigger than you could ever imagine. See, our love might be smaller than we want to admit, but God's love is bigger than we could ever imagine. And for us to think about how huge that love of God is, I want us to just ask another question, and this is another one that you can kind of half discuss among yourselves, but I don't want it to go too far in the wrong direction. The question is this: what's the worst thing you've ever done? Now, if you're going to discuss it in your family groups, first of all, please don't give any brand new revelations that are going to just take up the rest of your day in discussion. And also don't drag up from the dirt anything that shouldn't be dragged up. But maybe just talk about how actually we do need to admit that we have done things that are wrong. So just for a minute, just think about the worst things or some of the things that we really wish that we hadn't done, and we're really regretful of them. Hmm? Well, I'm not going to try and imagine some of the conversations that could have been had. And just to say, it isn't a bad thing to talk about these things, including things that we may not have talked about before. But maybe in the middle of a service isn't the best place. But it's definitely good to be honest with each other, particularly within families. What's the worst thing you've ever done? I wonder if you asked Peter that question, what would he say? I think he would say this moment where he denied Jesus 3 times. Now let's be real about Peter. Peter, I think one of the reasons why everyone loves Peter, is the fact that he's so relatable. He's the guy who says all the silly stuff, like I'll never forsake you, and then he does this, and he's the guy who chops off someone's ear with a sword when they come to arrest Jesus. That was a bit silly. and I'm sure his life was filled with so many mistakes that he made. Again, it's why we like Peter, because the Bible's so real about him, and he's someone that we can all think, yeah, I'm like that. I sometimes say something silly. I sometimes, speak before I think. I sometimes chop people's ear. No, hopefully we don't do that. But I think Peter would have probably said the time that he feels the worst thing he's ever done was to deny Jesus those 3 times. And actually, what Jesus talking to Peter on the beach shows isn't that he doesn't love Jesus. I mean, I don't think Jesus is asking him that question 3 times to show him that he doesn't actually love him at all. No, it's to show him that he really does, but he needs that love to grow. I think one way that we see that Peter definitely loved Jesus is the fact that when he realized, when the cockerel crowed, he broke down in tears because he loved Jesus. But that love wasn't showing because his love wasn't deep enough. And I think for him, that moment when he denied Jesus, and now this moment on the beach, is a place when Peter is realizing that his sin and his failing and his lack of love is bigger than he could ever imagine. You see, when we ask that question, how deep is your love, or how much do you love Jesus, it's always clouded by the fact that our sin is so heavy, our sin is so big. Every single one of us has done things that are against God, things that have gone our own way and not his way. And our sin is so heavy. Our sin is so big. And whatever we try, we cannot outweigh our sin. We can put all our efforts in. We can try as hard as we like. We can do all kinds of things, but all the efforts in the world will never make our sin go away. We can never wipe away our sin. The only way that our sin can be wiped away, the only thing that's heavier and bigger than our sin, is what God has done in Jesus Christ. And so we can see on those scales, if we can imagine scales that have our sin as being so heavy and nothing else can outweigh them, the thing that can is God's love. You see, God's love is always bigger than our failings. However much we've messed up, however weak our love might be, God's love is always bigger than the mistakes we've made. And so when we get to that beach scene again with Peter, Jesus saying, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" He is testing Peter and helping Peter to see how his love is weaker than he wants to admit. But he doesn't leave it there, because each time he asks him, "Do you love me?" And when Peter replies, Jesus adds something to each of those questions. He says, "Do you love me?" Peter says, "Yes." "You know I do." Well, yeah, that's what he says, "You know it." And Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." Second time he says, "Take care of my sheep." Third time he says, "Feed my sheep." All slight variations in saying the same thing. Look after the people that I put in your care. We can talk about it in terms of the local church, where we have a group of God's people, and he calls us to take care of each other, and especially those who are in leadership, to feed my lambs, or to take care of my sheep, or feed my sheep. And it's a calling that reflects the fact that Peter is being restored. You see, he may have made a mistake, but God's love is bigger, so big that he not only says, "Okay, it's all right," but he gives him a job. He gives him an incredibly important job. In fact, he had already told Peter that he was going to be Peter the Rock. He was going to be hugely important in the church as it grew. And he was. We read the book of Acts and we see that, Peter's the main guy speaking on the day of Pentecost when 3,000 people come to the Lord. God is using Peter, even though Peter is a failure in his own terms. When God is using him, God uses him for great things. So, this is an incredible thing. When we ask, "How deep is your love?" actually, the question always should be met with the answer that it's not deep enough. You see, your love for God is smaller than you'd like to think. But God's love for you is bigger than you can ever imagine. And that's why that if we have said sorry for our sins, if we ask Jesus to be the King of our life and our Savior, then we can know that God has plans for us to use us in ways that reflect that we've been forgiven for the things we've done wrong. And that he has things that he wants to do through us. Not because we're brilliant, You know, we look at the example of Peter, and he was the guy who made the mistake after mistake after mistake, and maybe you and I feel that we do that too. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't want to use us, not because of our brilliance, but because of his brilliance. And so this is a wonderful, wonderful reminder. Your love for God is smaller than you'd like to admit, but God's love for you is bigger than you could ever imagine. So be encouraged as we go forward that God has plans to use you if you are trusting in him, if you're following Jesus.